in this case, individualistic farming as opposed to collective or commercial or corporate farming, or maybe even household farming. So in a sense, if you want, the fate of the family farm in post-Soviet agriculture, where it emerged as a counter movement with partially strong political intentions and agendas, as a counter movement to the existing collective type of agricultural production. Yeah. And it is still also considered by many as a also strongly political counter movement to commercialization processes and processes of agribusiness formation. Yeah. So that secondly, also the question of the coexistence of different types of farming plays an absolutely crucial role in this debate and in this part of the world. Yeah. So you see here a picture of a Kyrgyz individual farm, of a Kyrgyz family farm that could also emerge, that could only emerge due to the collapse of socialism 3 decades ago. And whether or not this type of farming will be the future of agriculture in the post-Soviet region, that is a topic of my talk. So I'll try to go through it quickly, so not to overstretch your time. Also, I see that we have been discussing now and listening now for more than an hour, just to get you the point quickly. Yeah. So let's start with the expectations about post-socialist agricultural restructuring. Many of you will be aware of the fact that it has been 30 years exactly this year that the Soviet Union collapsed. 32 years ago, the Berlin Wall crumbled. And that opened the whole debate, big debate on transition in many parts of the economy and the society, but especially also so in the agricultural sector, where in the early 90s, individual smallholder or family farming, as they were variously titled, were considered not only as more productive, but also as more egalitarian than the collective and corporate farms that preceded them. Reasons brought up by economists were advantages in labor supervision, investment incentives, and the absence of scale economies in agriculture. And I will especially look at these type of factors, or they form the background of my study, as I consider myself as a true-bred agricultural economist with a wide interest, though, in neighboring disciplines. So from that perspective, the comprehensive shift to individual farming would be both desirable and also evolutionary inevitable due to the economic superiority of this type of farms, unless governments would stand in the way and prevent that, right? So that could be condensed into a claim that some of the colleagues at the time articulated that goes that all countries embarking on an individualization path would display rising productivity levels. Yeah, that would kind of condense that view in one sentence, and would also establish a level of analysis that I will also follow now, namely doing a cross-country comparison of the restructuring experience. So I'd like to look back and take stock of the reform outcomes 30 years later in light of these initial expectations of the superiority of individual farming. I shared a background paper with you in which you find much more references and also empirical analysis. Just as an overview, a chart here, this is the restructuring, the change of ownership in land, or actually not in ownership, but rather in cultivation practice in a set of post-Soviet countries that you see listed here in the bottom line, and where you generally see a shift from red to green, meaning from corporate farms, which I use as a label here for the post-collective farms, the farms that often emerged by changing the sign on the door of the former collectives, later transformed into agro holdings, and the individual sector, which was considered as the political and economic alternative. Yeah. You see actually that it took quite some time in all of these countries before individualization took off, almost 20 years in almost all of them, and also to a very different degree. The three countries on the left here, which are the European successor countries, in general progressed much less than the countries further east in Central Asia especially. Yeah, I brought some pictures about these individual farms. Here from various countries of the former Soviet Union. You see, especially from this one here, that individual farmer does not necessarily mean smallholder farmer. Yeah, these are massive tractors used in the Kazakh steppe, but a whole variety of people, of course. Yeah. At the same time, we observed a revival of corporate farms after a while. Capital injections started, management was replaced, and I think at around the turn of the millennium, you would observe that corporate farms were there to stay, managed to upgrade substantially their technologies and also their management capacities. Property rights, of course, were a key issue in terms of land reform, which in the beginning was often based on paper shares. It still is, meaning people get certificates of certain land use rights, but they were not worth much more than the ink on the paper. Yeah, so land markets generally don't work very well in the region. Use rights are restricted or difficult to enforce legally. I mentioned the emergence of agro-holdings already, largely vertically integrated production and processing facilities, and a continuing elite interest in tradable commodities that was also a clear political factor in the restructuring of agriculture in these countries, such as grains in Europe or cotton in Central Asia. Yeah, which brings me to a third type of producers, which are a speciality, I think, of the former Soviet countries, at least if we compare them to Europe, namely subsistence or semi-commercial rural household producers who always had contributed a major fraction of total output of agriculture in these countries, and which persist up to date and still make a significant contribution to food security and nutrition in the whole set of countries. I'm sure when you go there in September, Sergio, you will manage to see many of them left and right of the road, traveling through this vast country. At least if Sasha takes you out of Moscow. And indeed, if we look more closely at the numbers, you see that the rural households play a partially overwhelming role in production and land use. Yeah? Here, the same set of countries. In some countries, the statistical distinction is not so clear. But if you look always on the right bar here, which is the shares and output, yeah, you see that in almost all countries except Russia and Ukraine, households produce more than half of the output. So after long reform delays in the 90s, individual farms indeed emerged, cultivate now about half of the farmland. Individualization is mostly completed in the Transcaucasian countries and in the rest of Central Asia to date. But as I just mentioned, up to 2/3 of output is still contributed by households. Yeah, now let me guide you through some figures that I assembled in order to illustrate connections between this degree of individualization and the change in output and labor use and labor productivity. So you see here the share of agricultural land in the individual sector as the key metric of restructuring success of the progress of individualization. You see countries given with their country names, and each country is represented here with a dot for 4 different points in time. The outset in the early 1990s, then 2000, 2010, and 2019. So in 10-year steps. Yeah? And the colors are getting darker here, and you see that this cloud is moving from left to right here. Yeah? It's spreading out actually to the right. And what I'm measuring here is the change in agricultural output as an index, yeah, where 0 is just constant output compared to the last day of the last year of the Soviet Union. And above the horizontal line means an increase in output, below means a contraction of output actually. Yeah, and you see that the claim that many brought forward in the beginning, namely that with increasing individualization, output would generally improve, so productivity would improve, is fairly clearly borne out here, at least for the countries that you observe on the right here, which is those which experience the most complete individualization, countries of the Transcaucasus and Central Asia especially. Whereas the large European countries Russia, Ukraine, and also Moldova, and also Kazakhstan, which I include here, they kept below the zero line for most of the time. Yeah? So they could not increase productivity over these years, despite some progress in individualization. Nevertheless, by and large, this figure here seems to support and to prove this claim that I mentioned in the beginning, that with increasing individualization, productivity would rise, and it would be from the productivity point of view, but possibly also from the equality point of view, from the egalitarian point of view, it would be a desirable mode of farming. Yeah. Now, however, the picture becomes more subtle when we look at the changes in labor use and labor productivity. So here the same x-axis, the same metric here for individualization, but now plotted against the change in agricultural labor use. And we see here that we actually see a clear distinction, a disassociation or dissociation in two kind of clouds, two groups, clusters of countries. So the countries that were less progressing with individualization, they actually also saw a strong decline in labor use. So people migrated away from the rural areas where corporate structures took over much of the farmland, or actually kept much of the farmland. Yeah? That's actually what this cloud here is all about. I called it the corporate depopulated European CIS. CIS is the successor countries of the Soviet Union, including Kazakhstan. Whereas the other group, the overpopulated, individualized countries in the Transcaucasus and Central Asia, they form this group that held the upper share here, which actually increased the labor input in agriculture, yeah? Primarily driven by high fertility rates in rural areas. As a side note, all of these countries are Muslim countries with a Muslim majority, right? Whereas the majority of people working on the land in these countries below here have a Christian denomination. I'm just mentioning this as a fact. Yeah. Here, my last slide of this sort, I bring the two together. I calculate the labor productivity. So I calculate the ratio of output per worker. By the way, this is all coming from partially questionable, but the best evidence that we have, data from FAO and International Labour Office, international comparable statistics published by these countries. This figure actually illustrates my major claim, namely that rather than having this clear tendency that I mentioned in the beginning, that we have a clear connection between individualization and productivity growth, we have a dissociation in terms of labor productivity, again, into two groups. And these two groups I call, a bit provocative, I think, the westernizing and the southernizing group of countries of the former Soviet Union. So the westernizing group is the group that's actually located further west, but that's not why I call it. I call it westernizing because it resembles structural changing trends that we observe in Europe, for example, also North America. Not so sure about Latin America, but I'm sure you know about that. Meaning that we have a strong force of agribusinesses, of corporate agriculture, which continued partially even dominating, especially the cash crops and the commercial agriculture production, which goes along with stagnating or even declining labor use, but rising labor productivity, strongly rising labor productivity actually. And that is exactly what we observe in these countries here. Whereas the southernizing group in Transcaucasus and Central Asia is one where we see a strong individualization, but that leads to phenomena that we know from the global south, from many countries of the global south. I mean, with the risk of overgeneralizing, of course. But you see here phenomena like overpopulation, low labor productivity, low degrees of technology transfer, and high degrees of informality, high degrees of subsistence production. Yeah, so that basically summarizes what I just said. Just recapitulating once more this central claim, yeah, we have this westernization of the Western countries of the former Soviet Union with the coexistence of corporate and family farming, strong labor outflow into other sectors, rising labor productivity and vertical integration, with one important caveat compared to other places, especially Europe and Northern America. There remains a static labor-intensive household sector that is persisting in all of these countries. Whereas in the countries I call the southernizing countries, this sector kind of merges or is hard to distinguish from the individual farming sector. And all these cultivators have in common that they lack outside opportunities in terms of income, yeah? That they maintain high fertility rates, which keep the workers in agriculture unless they migrate abroad. We see problems of persisting poverty, slow capital penetration, and continuing informality of contractual relations. I give more background papers and evidence in the paper. Yeah, that brings me to my conclusions. I think there are a couple of misconceptions abounding in the literature on post-Soviet agricultural restructuring. And some of the misconceptions are that individual smallholder and family farming are all the same. I just gave you a glimpse of that argument. Yeah. So actually, in some places, yes, they may be the same, but in other places, especially in those which display more dynamic changes, they are very different. Yeah, namely in places like Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan. Yeah. Individual farmers may be highly commercial. They may not be small. In Kazakhstan, we are talking about family farmers of up to 1,000 hectares of area, but that I'm sure is familiar to you. And many of them also work on hired labor basis, for example. Farm individualization is not a success factor per se, I argue. Yeah, so that is a misconception to consider it as such. It's not true that all of the post-socialist countries converge towards a fully individualized farming sector, which is also no longer the reality in the West, right? And farm individualization is also not the same as establishing strong property rights. Actually, the post-Soviet countries prove quite the opposite. So I'd say, in terms of a general evaluation, the firm establishment of individual and restructured corporate farms in all successor countries is a reform achievement. So we are clearly no longer talking about collective farms and also not about state farms. However, only a subset of the individual farms play the role of a dynamic growth engine. Household farms remain as an important social and economic buffer stock. And there are all signs that corporate farming structures are here to stay in many countries, a phenomenon that we also observe in the West, actually an emerging one, now also in Europe and Northern America. The macro trends that I mentioned, population growth, non-farm employment will remain very decisive for agriculture in the years to come. Yeah, and with this last slide, let me reconnect this to the global restructuring debate, to the global debate about the future of agriculture, agribusiness, and land use. Yeah, this is kind of propositions, as I call them. Yeah, they are kind of thesis, maybe provocative claims, partially, for which I think this group of countries that we are investigating here provides evidence, and more for which we can also, about which we can learn from this group of countries. But these are all questions that are relevant at the global level for basically all countries worldwide. Yeah. So I think that our group of countries here, my group of countries here, provides evidence that low labor productivity on small farms disappear with economy-wide growth, urbanization, and farm consolidation. That is the processes that we observe in the more Western successor countries of the Soviet Union. The small is beautiful strategy that was very popular in the 1990s in the region and that continues to be popular in many countries of the global South. I think it can be argued that it hampers the selection of entrepreneurial talent into agriculture and therefore may perpetuate structures that are not desirable from the point of view of poverty eradication or general improvement of living standards. If we follow this argument, then the conclusion would be that policy should shift focus from land redistribution to labor upgrading. So have a much stronger focus on the perspectives for labor rather than on maybe partially futile discussions and ill fated political initiatives to redistribute land and to harden property rights. And my last point, I end with a question mark, namely, to what extent can we learn from this region about flexibility and transparency of these consolidation processes that may bring economic development. Of course, this region is far away from practicing transparent and fair exchanges on the major production resources in agriculture. Yeah, I mentioned the problems of informality, of elite interests, of power play, of power imbalances, also of opaque structures within agribusiness, agri-holdings, strong political influence in some regions. Maybe we can learn from it as a counterexample of what can go wrong and what should be avoided in other places. But it's certainly also an interesting area of study.